Okay, joining us now for more on this, Philip Yoon. He's the executive director of the Ploughshares Fund. He used to work as the North Korean advisor to US President Bill Clinton, also a senior advisor to Defense Secretary William Perry, and we're lucky to have you with us. So, Philip, on his way home from the Winter Games, the US Vice President, Mike Pence, he spoke to CNN analyst Josh Rogan. This is part of the conversation from Josh.
On the way home on the plane, he told me about those negotiations, and what happened was fascinating. Essentially, Vice President Pence asked Moon Jae-in why he should support further engagement with North Korea, and Moon Jae-in made a promise that North Korea would not receive any sanctions relief until they actually take steps towards denuclearization. Based on that promise and that assurance, Pence endorsed further cooperation and engagement with North Korea, first by the South Koreans, and then potentially directly between Washington and Pyongyang.
Phil, just to flesh this out with a little bit more from Josh's story in the Washington Post, this is what he reports. The point is, no pressure comes off until they're actually doing something that the alliance believes represents a meaningful step towards denuclearization. So the maximum pressure campaign is going to continue and intensify, but if you want to talk, we'll talk. This is what Pence said. So riddle me this. Why would the North Koreans want to talk if there's no incentive?
Well, I think what we're talking about here is a plan that the United States has had for a while. They've had two components. It's been really increasing defensive measures to show the North Koreans that the United States will protect itself and its allies, and then put increasing pressure on North Korea. What has been missing out of all this component is forcing them into a position where they want to talk and an offer of talk. So this potential shift that Vice President Pence talked about is actually, I think, is quite welcome. We'll have to see if there's anything there. And it's all about hypothesis testing. In fact, if the North Koreans want to actually are willing to take a deal or not. But we're going to have to see, and that's why we have to talk. We haven't had any discussion, so we really don't know what North Korea actually wants. And as I said before, the only American who has spoken with Kim Jong-un is Dennis Rodman. So we've got to do a little bit better than that.
You'd hope. Is this sort of a return to the era of strategic patience, which someone a while ago said was over and had failed?
No, I don't really think so. I think there is some talk about how the North Koreans have genuinely been worried or are now thinking possibly that this talk about a preemptive strike is actually real. So they're hedging their bets to some degree. I think part of what they did in November is declare that they had a nuclear deterrent, and so there was a face-saving way for them to stop and to initiate, which is essentially a self-imposed moratorium, depending on what the United States does. And I think it all is going to come back to whether or not these war exercises that usually happen at this time of year are actually initiated or somehow modified or changed in some fashion. When we get through this Olympic moment, the key discussion has always been, what are we going to do to follow up? And if we don't follow up with this easing of tensions, we're going to be right back to where we were about 2 or 3 months ago.
And with that in mind, the man who would likely take charge of any negotiations with the North Koreans, he seems less than enthusiastic. Listen to Rex Tillerson.
As to the Vice President's comments about potentially having talks and whether it's the start of a diplomatic process, I think it's too early to judge. As we've said for some time, it's really up to the North Koreans to decide when they're ready to engage with us in a sincere way, a meaningful way. They know what has to be on the table for conversations. We've said for some time that I think it's important that we're going to need to have some discussions that precede any form of negotiation.
You know, it sounds like Tillerson's, they're talking about talks about having talks, and the Koreans are, the North Koreans rather, they're masters at this whole let's talk about talks and stringing everybody along.
Well, I think what you have to do is start right now is I think the idea of informal talks about talks actually makes sense. It's the idea that people will save face and that they don't have to go in with certain positions already in line. In other words, the United States doesn't have to agree to stop doing its military exercises with South Korea, and North Korea doesn't have to say it wants to, it will be willing to denuclearize. What they can do is say about talks, we can raise any issue that we want in an informal setting. setting. And this is the only way, I think, as in terms of a mechanism, that both of these two sides can actually start some kind of discussion to see if there is any kind of overlap there. I don't know if there is at this point. It seems that North Korea, their opening positions are determined to have a small nuclear arsenal capable of hitting the United States, and the United States position is that we're going to prevent that from happening. There doesn't seem to be a lot of wiggle room here, and if we are going to have prevent a showdown of sorts, and a game of chicken, we have to start talking and talk about talks as where it has to start before we can get anywhere.
And Phil, just very quickly, in terms of diplomacy and public relations, Kim Jong-un's having a great Olympics.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think to some degree, I think the reason why the vice president talked to Josh Rogan about this was because I think they got outmaneuvered quite a bit on the public relations side, and he wanted to show some flexibility on the part of the United States, which obviously has created some news. And if it's in fact true, I think it's a potential opening.
Okay, well, you know, let's hope, because clearly the way things have been is totally unsustainable. Philip, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it.